Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
It was the summer of 2008 when I took a job at Belladonna Waxing Salon, a shabby little place tucked into the shadowy edge of the city's roughest neighborhood. The salon was a relic of the past, its peeling paint and flickering neon sign barely clinging to life. It was open 6 days a week, from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. But the only people who ever worked there were me and the owner, a woman named Margot. She'd come in during the mornings to handle the handful of regulars, mostly older women who didn't seem to notice the grime on the floors or the faint smell of mildew that clung to the air. By 3 p.m. Margot would leave and I'd be alone until closing. The salon was eerily quiet most nights. The streets outside were desolate, the kind of place where the flicker of a street light could make your skin crawl. I rarely had customers after dark, so I spent my time cleaning the same surfaces over and over, scrubbing until my hands were raw. It was mind-numbing work, but it paid the bills, and Margot trusted me enough to leave me in charge. I didn't mind the solitude until that night. It was just after sunset, the sky a deep bruised purple. I had, 2 hours left on my shift, and the boredom was really gnawing at me. I decided to clean the big front window, the one that looked out onto the empty street. I grabbed a rag and started wiping down the glass, my reflection staring back at me in the dim light. The street outside was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I knelt to clean the bottom pane of the door, taking my time to make sure every smudge was gone. When I stood up, she was there, right in front of me, on the other side of the glass. I screamed, stumbling backward. Her face was inches from mine, her hollow eyes locked onto me. She was impossibly thin, her skin stretched tight over her bones like a living corpse. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips cracked and peeling, but it was her eyes that froze me in place, dark, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. For a moment, I thought she was dead, but then her head began to twitch, jerking to the side in sharp, unnatural movements. Her mouth fell open and a sound crawled out of her throat, a guttural, clicking noise that didn't sound human. It was like the grinding of broken bones, the kind of sound that makes your stomach turn. I backed away, my heart pounding. I wished I had my keys, wished there was a deadbolt on the door. But there wasn't. She just stood there staring at me, making that awful noise. I tried to speak, my voice trembling. "Excuse me, can I help you?" She didn't answer. Her head kept twitching, her mouth hanging open. Then, without breaking eye contact, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, but the sound was wrong, too sharp, too loud. She moved stiffly, like her joints didn't work right, and that clicking noise followed her like a shadow. "Hey, you can't be in here!" I shouted, but she didn't even flinch. Her eyes drifted away from me, staring at something I couldn't see. She took another step forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I stayed frozen, my breath caught in my throat. She walked past me, her presence so heavy it felt like the room was shrinking around her. I watched as she moved toward the back of the salon, where the waxing rooms were. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe she was just some homeless woman, lost and confused. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. "Hey, you can't go back there," I called after her, but she didn't stop. She walked through the open door of one of the rooms, and that sound, that horrible, inhuman sound, followed her in. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my legs refusing to move. Finally, I forced myself to approach the room, my footsteps silent on the worn carpet. I peeked around the corner, and what I saw will haunt me forever. She was on the waxing bed, her body twisted and contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Her limbs bent at unnatural angles, her spine arching like a broken doll. And then she snapped her head toward me, her neck cracking loudly. Her mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, and she screamed, "Watch me wax! I didn't breathe, I just ran." I bolted out of the salon, my keys fumbling in my hands as I sprinted to my car. I locked the doors and sat there, shaking, my eyes glued to the salon's front window. The street was still empty, the only sound the pounding of my heart. I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. When they arrived, they didn't seem too concerned, until they saw the state I was in. They went inside to investigate, and I watched from my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Minutes later, they came back out, their faces blank. "There's no one in there," one of them said. I didn't believe them. I went back inside, searching every corner, every room. But she was gone. There was no back door, no way she could have left without me seeing her. And yet she had vanished. The cops asked for security footage, but I remembered. Margot had been too cheap to fix the cameras. They hadn't been working for months. There was no proof she'd ever been there. I quit that night. I couldn't go back. Not after what I'd seen. It's been over a decade now, but I still think about her. The woman who wasn't a woman. The thing that crawled onto that bed and screamed at me. I don't know what she was, but I know she wasn't human. And I know she's still out there, somewhere waiting for the next person to make the mistake of looking into her hollow, hungry eyes. Belladonna Waxing Salon closed down a year later. The building still stands, empty and decaying, a monument to whatever darkness lurks in that part of town. Sometimes when I drive past it, I swear I can see her in the window, her face pressed against the glass, watching me with those dead, empty eyes. And I wonder, who will she haunt next? It was the winter of 2015, and I was in my mid-20s, fresh out of college with a degree in physical therapy. But, life had other plans for me. After months of fruitless job hunting, I found myself desperate for cash and took a job at a waxing salon in the worst part of town. The place was called Velvet Skin, though there was nothing velvety or soft about it. It was a grimy, dimly lit hole, tucked between a pawn shop and a liquor store, in a neighborhood where the air always smelled faintly of burnt rubber and despair. The area was notorious for its crime, robberies, gang activity, and the occasional scream in the night. Every morning I'd dodge the same group of junkies loitering outside the salon, their hollow eyes following me as they begged for money or worse, a free wax. It was a humiliating way to start the day, but I had no choice. I was broke, and this job was my last resort. The salon itself was a nightmare. The floors were sticky, the walls were stained, and the air was thick with the stench of cheap perfume and unwashed bodies. The clientele were the dregs of society, bums, addicts, and lowlifes who seemed to revel in their own filth. Most employees quit within weeks, but I stuck it out. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find something better soon. But as the weeks turned into months, I felt myself sinking deeper into a pit of resentment and self-loathing. By February, I was at my breaking point. Valentine's Day was approaching, and the salon was swamped with clients. As the newest hire, I got the worst of it. Back-to-back appointments, no breaks, and no overtime pay. My boss, a cold woman named Diane, hid in her office while I worked myself to the bone. I was exhausted, overworked, and on the verge of a mental breakdown. And then on one fateful day, I met him. His name was Victor, a mountain of a man with a beard so thick it looked like it could house a family of raccoons. He waddled into the salon, his bulk barely fitting through the door, and flashed me a grin that made my skin crawl. "Victor, we're ready for you," I called out, my voice flat. He didn't respond at first, and for a brief moment, I dared to hope he hadn't shown up. But then he lumbered forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the reception desk. "Full body wax," he barked, his voice like gravel. I blinked. "Are you sure? did I stutter? He snapped. Full body wax. Now move it, sweetheart. I don't have all day. I forced a smile and led him to the back room, my mind racing. A full body wax on a man his size would take hours. Hours I didn't have, but I had no choice. I handed him a robe and told him to undress, relieved when he left his underwear on. As soon as he lay down on the table, I got to work. The first strip of wax came off with a satisfying rip. Victor yelped, his face contorting in pain. I couldn't help but smirk. The big, tough guy was already whimpering like a child. I poured all my pent-up frustration into the task, working faster and harder than I ever had before. Each strip of wax was a release, a small act of revenge against the world that had brought me to this point. By the time I was halfway through, Victor was sobbing. Tears streamed down his face as he begged me to stop. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me had snapped, and I was no longer in control. His cries only fueled me, making me laugh as I ripped strip after strip from his body. When it was finally over, Victor looked like a hairless, bloated walrus. He stumbled out of the room, his skin raw and red, and collapsed into a chair in the waiting area. I didn't care. I was too busy calling the next client. But then Diane appeared, her face pale with rage. She took one look at Victor and started apologizing profusely, offering him discounts and free services. Once he was gone, she turned on me, her eyes blazing. "What the hell did you do to him?" she hissed. I shrugged. He asked for a full body wax. I gave him a full body wax. Diane stormed into the back room and began rifling through my supplies. That's when she found it, a bottle of industrial-strength adhesive, the kind used for heavy-duty repairs. She held it up, her hands trembling. "Did you use this on him?" she demanded. I stared at the bottle, my mind blank. I didn't remember bringing it to work. I didn't remember using it, but the evidence was there, staring me in the face. I must have been in such a dark place that I thought it was a good idea. Diane fired me on the spot. I didn't argue. I didn't care. I walked out of that salon and never looked back. Years have passed since that day, and my life has gotten better. I found a job in my field and my mental health has improved, but I still think about Victor. I wonder if he ever recovered, if he ever got his revenge, and I wonder if somewhere out there he's still telling the story of the woman who turned him into a hairless, whimpering mess. As for me, I'll never forget the look on his face as I ripped that last strip of wax from his body. It was the look of a man who had met his match. A man who had walked into velvet skin and walked out a changed person. And I'll always wonder, did he ever find love on Valentine's Day? It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a leap of faith and open my own business. My college friend Clara and I had always dreamed of being entrepreneurs, and after months of planning, we finally leased a small space in a rundown plaza about 15 minutes from my apartment. We opened Silk & Touch, a waxing salon that promised to cater to every hair removal need imaginable. Brazilian waxes, full body waxes, eyebrow shaping, you name it. The place was modest. A lobby with a front desk, a washroom, and 2 waxing rooms, one on the first floor and another upstairs. At first, things were shaky. We were nervous, unsure if we'd even get customers. But to our surprise, people started coming in. College girls, women prepping for dates, and even a few men who were brave enough to endure the pain. Business was good, and the money was steady. I'll admit, there was something oddly satisfying about hearing customers scream during their waxing sessions. It wasn't that I enjoyed their pain, okay, maybe a little, but it was more about the absurdity of it all. People willingly subjected themselves to this agony just to be hairless. It was fascinating. But as the months went by, things took a dark turn. Clara, who had always been reliable and level-headed, started acting strange. At first it was little things, odd comments, strange habits. Then one day, she walked into the salon carrying a plastic bag. Thick red liquid was oozing out of it, staining the floor as she walked. My stomach churned as she pulled out what looked like raw meat. Cow liver and spleen, she said, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. Want some? Before I could respond, she took a bite. Raw. Blood dripped down her chin as she chewed, her eyes glazed over with something I couldn't quite place. I forced a smile, trying to play it off as some cultural quirk, but deep down I was horrified. Who eats raw organs like they're snacking on chips? Things only got worse from there. Clara started calling in sick more often, her voice slurred and erratic over the phone. She'd ramble incoherently, lashing out at me for no reason. When she did show up to work, she'd apologize profusely, acting like her usual self, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Then came the day that changed everything. I was doing paperwork at the front desk when I accidentally nicked my finger on a piece of paper. It was a small cut, but it bled enough that I reached for a bandage. Before I could even grab one, Clara lunged at me, grabbing my hand and licking the blood off my finger. Her tongue was cold and rough like a cat's, and her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "What the hell, Clara?" I shouted, yanking my hand away. She just smiled, her lips stained red. "We're out of bandages. I was just helping." I forced a laugh, pretending it was no big deal, but inside I was screaming. What the hell was wrong with her? Later that day, as we were wrapping up, I heard a scream from the downstairs waxing room. It wasn't the usual yelp of pain. It was desperate, guttural, like someone was being tortured. My heart raced as I crept downstairs, my footsteps silent on the creaky wooden stairs. The closer I got, the more I could hear. Gurgling, moaning, the sound of something wet and heavy being dragged across the floor. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling, when Clara suddenly appeared behind me. She slammed the door shut, her face inches from mine. Her mouth was smeared with blood, her teeth bared in a grotesque grin. Her eyes were wild, unhinged, like a predator cornering its prey. "What are you doing down here?" she hissed. I stammered, backing away. I thought I heard something." She tilted her head, her grin widening. "Just finishing up. Go back upstairs." I didn't argue. I bolted up the stairs and sat at the front desk, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial my phone. Should I call the cops? Run? I didn't know what to do. Moments later, Clara appeared, her face clean, her demeanor calm. "Sorry about that," she said, her voice sweet and innocent. "I just had a late lunch. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing a smile, but my mind was racing. What had I just witnessed? What was she doing down there? That night, I told Clara I wanted out. I couldn't do this anymore. She tried to convince me to stay, her voice trembling with hurt and confusion. But my mind was made up. I sold my share of the business and never looked back. Months passed, and I tried to forget about Clara and the salon. But sometimes, late at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the image of her blood-stained face and the screams from that waxing room. I never found out what happened to that customer, or what Clara was really doing down there. And though I've tried to move on, a part of me still wonders, if I had stayed, would I have been next?